In December 1944, the most elite German panzer unit advanced only by siphoning American fuel. Post-war, German generals explained their defeat, but omitted the critical factor. They overlooked an entire logistical network built for human morale, not firepower. Its true impact was buried, invisible to their military doctrine. This is the story of that invisible force and the women who wielded it. 2 months after Germany's surrender, Liz Richardson boarded a Piper Cub light aircraft. She was flying to Paris for new orders, reassigning her to Germany. Near Rouen, the plane flew into heavy fog and crashed. Liz Richardson was killed. She was 27 years old. The pilot, Sergeant William R. Miller of the 9th Air Force, also died. Liz Richardson is buried at the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, Plot A, Row 21, Grave 5. She is one of only 4 women buried there. Thousands of soldiers died taking the beaches she had spent a year serving donuts behind. On May 1, 1945, 8 days before Germany's formal surrender, Dorothy Burge was killed in a plane crash in Germany. She was 29 years old. She had survived the entire war. She did not survive the peace. Dorothy, a schoolteacher, joined the Red Cross and went overseas in September 1943. She and her sister Grace operated a Clubmobile together. They drove from England through Normandy, across France through Belgium, and into Germany. The Burge sisters served side by side through some of the war's worst fighting. They had spent professional lives in classrooms with children. Now they drove a 2.5-ton truck through a destroyed landscape, making donuts for young men. These men were often younger than their former students. They faced things no classroom could prepare anyone for. Grace carried that loss for the rest of her life. This war had a different kind of weapon. A weapon the Germans never saw. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Germany's senior commander on the Western Front, was captured in May 1945. Asked why Germany lost, he gave 3 reasons: Allied air power, lack of motor fuel, systematic destruction of the railway network. 3 clean military answers from a professional soldier: air, fuel, rail. That was his verdict. He mentioned nothing about the trucks. Not the ones carrying ammunition or food. He certainly didn't mention the other trucks. These trucks carried donut machines, phonograph records, coffee urns, and daily newspapers. They were driven by college-educated women from Connecticut, Indiana, and Virginia. These women volunteered to follow the U.S. Army across Europe. Their purpose: hand a 19-year-old rifleman a hot donut and ask where he was from. Rundstedt did not mention these trucks. They were invisible to him, not because they were hidden, but because his entire military education had no category for them. The Wehrmacht understood firepower. It understood maneuver. It understood supply. It did not understand sending a 2.5-ton GMC truck, full of pastries and popular music, to a crossroads 3 miles behind the fighting. It staffed it with 3 young women who could crack a joke and pour coffee in a snowstorm. It let it sit while exhausted infantrymen lined up for something unrelated to battle, but essential to winning a war. Reset beat. A reframe. These weren't simply comforts. They were a strategic lever, an operational truth German military thought could never grasp. A donut is flour, sugar, lard, and baking powder. You can make one in 4 minutes. It has no military value. It does not stop a bullet. It does not move a division. It does not win a battle. And yet, during the deadliest conflict in human history, the United States built an industrial system capable of producing hundreds of donuts per minute. It delivered them to front lines so close that the women delivering them sometimes camouflaged their trucks with netting to avoid German aircraft. Why? Why would a country fighting for its survival invest fuel, vehicles, shipping tonnage, and human lives into getting a fried pastry into the hands of a private in a foxhole? The German military never found an answer, not during the war nor after. Their post-war memoirs spanned tens of thousands of pages. They covered American air power, armor, industrial production, and logistics. Almost none described the system that made American soldiers believe their country cared whether they lived or died. This system, the donut trucks, the coffee urns, USO shows, daily newspapers, portable Coca-Cola bottling plants was not a luxury. It was a weapon. The Germans never recognized it. That failure of recognition contributed to their loss. This tradition began, not in the Second World War, but the First, in a flooded tent on the Western Front. October 1917, Ensign Helen Purviance of the Salvation Army, 28 years old, from Huntington, Indiana, dropped to her knees on a dirt floor. She fried 7 donuts in a small pan over an open flame. She accidentally created a tradition. This tradition would follow the American soldier for the next 30 years, and across 2 oceans. She arrived in France as one of 4 Salvation Army volunteers. They were assigned to the 1st Ammunition Train, 1st Division, near the Western Front. Her partner in that small, waterlogged tent was Ensign Margaret Sheldon. They were sent to do what they could for soldiers stationed at Montier-sur-Saulx. In October 1917, the village endured 36 consecutive days of rain. Mud was knee-deep, men were exhausted, cold, and far from home. Purviance and Sheldon made pies and fudge with what they could find. Supplies were thin, demand was enormous. Someone suggested donuts. Ingredients were available in standard American military rations: flour, sugar, lard, baking powder. Equipment was not. Purviance improvised. She used a wine bottle as a rolling pin. She cut dough with a baking powder tin lid. For the center hole, she and Sheldon used a spent shell casing. The frying pan was small. She could cook only 7 donuts at a time. Purviance later described the moment. I was literally on my knees when those first donuts were fried, 7 at a time. The first donut went to Private Braxton Zuber of Alabama. Zuber reportedly took 1 bite and said, "If this is war, let it continue. Reset beat C, pivot." From this individual, almost accidental act of human kindness, an industrial-scale system of morale would emerge. On the first day, Purviance and Sheldon made 150 donuts. The next day, they made 300. Within weeks, word spread. Production at various Salvation Army stations climbed to 2,500, then to 9,000 donuts per day per unit. Some were fried in steel helmets over open fires, some in abandoned farmhouse kitchens. Tools were always improvised. Demand always outstripped supply. A young Salvation Army volunteer, 20-year-old Stella Young, later recounted to the Boston Daily Globe that a German shell landed near her tent. Shrapnel tore through it and through a donut pan. She had stepped away moments before. She went back to frying. Fewer than 250 Salvation Army volunteers served in France during WWII. Most were women. They were not nurses or officers. They had no formal military role. They came to remind American soldiers that someone from home gave a damn. Soldiers called them the Donut Lassies. The name stuck. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., an officer in France, wrote afterward, "Before the war, I felt that the Salvation Army was composed of a well-meaning lot of cranks. Now what help I can give them is theirs." These women discovered, without doctrine, something military thinkers would spend a century trying to articulate. The donut wasn't nutrition. A fighting man got calories from his ration tin. The donut was a transaction. It was an exchange between a soldier and his country. It was conducted through the hands of a woman who volunteered to stand in a war zone. Her specific purpose, make him feel like a person, not a serial number. It was an act of national intimacy. The country reached out through that donut saying, "I see you. I know you are cold and frightened and far from home. Here is something warm." The effect on morale baffled military professionals. A donut cost almost nothing. The goodwill generated was incalculable. When the war ended, soldiers remembered. They remembered the mud, the shells, the gas, and the donuts. In 1938, the Salvation Army established National Donut Day. It was a small commemoration. Nobody imagined that within 3 years, this small thing would scale into one of history's most extraordinary morale operations. Between the wars, America became the most logistics-capable nation on Earth. Henry Ford taught it assembly line automobile production. Cities were electrified, connected by highways, railroads, and telephone wires. Mass production applied to everything from canned soup to motion pictures. This industrial mentality would apply to sustaining a soldier's spirit 10,000 miles from home. Reset beat, B, count down. This ingenuity would soon confront the immense, unprecedented challenge of global conflict. When the American Red Cross built the Clubmobile system, it drew on a national culture of standardization, mass production, and logistical efficiency. This culture had no parallel. Germans built better tanks. Americans built a system that delivered a hot donut to the man next to the tank. They did it at a scale that made the delivery look easy, though it was anything but. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the American Red Cross received primary responsibility for military welfare and recreation overseas. Harvey D. Gibson, a New York banker and WWII Red Cross veteran, shaped this responsibility in Europe. He asked, what if you industrialized the idea that a hot donut and familiar face could hold a soldier together? The answer was the Clubmobile. The first Clubmobiles were converted London Green Line single-decker buses. They were retrofitted with donut machines, coffee urns, a lounge, a Victrola phonograph, loudspeakers, and popular records. They drove to wherever American troops were stationed in Britain, parked, and served. When the European invasion began, buses were replaced. The Red Cross converted approximately 100 GMC 25-ton military trucks. These were the same trucks carrying ammunition and fuel. Each Clubmobile truck had a donut machine, a Primus stove, a coffee urn, magazines, a phonograph, and a small space for soldiers to sit out of the rain, talk for 10 minutes. The Donut Corporation of America loaned 468 donut machines. Each machine produced 48 dozen donuts per hour, 576 donuts per machine per hour. Multiply that across 468 machines, running shifts in Europe and the Pacific, day after day, month after month, for years. The scale was immense. Between 1939 and 1946, the American Red Cross purchased enough flour for 1.6 billion donuts. At peak production in 1944-45, the system turned out 400 donuts per minute. A December 1944 report recorded 205 Red Cross women in Great Britain alone served over 4.6 million donuts in 31 days. The machines didn't run themselves. Trucks didn't drive themselves. The system required people. The Red Cross selected them carefully. The women who staffed Clubmobiles, called donut dollies, faced a more demanding process than military recruitment. Applicants had to be 25 to 35 years old, college graduates, single, healthy, physically hardy, sociable, and attractive. Only 1 in 6 applicants was accepted. This was a higher rejection rate than many combat units. Accepted women trained at American University in Washington, D.C. They received multiple immunizations, they were fitted for uniforms and issued 10 pages of regulations. No earrings, no bright nail polish, no excessive cosmetics. They trained in vehicle maintenance. They would drive and repair their own trucks. They learned how to talk to soldiers. This skill might seem strange until one considers these women faced hundreds of young men daily. Many had not spoken to an American woman in months. Some had just come off the line, unsure if they were still alive. The job demanded specific emotional endurance. Reset beat, D, direct college. It's easy to dismiss this as mere social work. The military understood it as combat readiness. A Clubmobile crew's daily routine was physically punishing. 3 women to a truck. They woke before dawn, mixed batter, heated oil, and began frying while driving to their assigned location. They served for hours, standing by the truck in rain, snow, or heat, pouring coffee, handing out donuts, making small talk with an unbroken line of soldiers. Many had just rotated off the line. Some would return to it within hours. The women were expected to be cheerful, remember names, make eye contact, and say something specific and human to every man. Not because a regulation required it, but because that eye contact, that individual recognition, was the entire point. A soldier could get food from a mess truck. He could not get the feeling that someone from home had come all the way to a war just to see him. The Red Cross operation in Britain alone was staggering. London's Rainbow Corner Club, a famous rest facility, served up to 60,000 meals in a single 24-hour period. Not a misprint. 60,000 meals in one day, in one building. For American servicemen on leave in an Allied capital, itself rationing food. The club had a dance floor, barbershop, tailor, photographer, mailroom and cafeteria. It was open around the clock. American soldiers coming in from the English winter's cold and rain entered a building that felt like a bus station in Cleveland or a diner in Philadelphia. This was intentional. Every detail replicated American civilian life as closely as possible, 5,000 miles from home. Clubmobiles were just one piece. The morale infrastructure following the U.S. Army across Europe and the Pacific was vast, logistically demanding, and integrated. Nothing like it existed before. The Germans had no equivalent. On June 29, 1943, General Eisenhower's North Africa headquarters cabled the War Department. It requested equipment for 10 portable Coca-Cola bottling plants, 3 million filled bottles, and supplies to produce that quantity twice monthly. Coca-Cola. President Robert Woodruff had promised in 1941 to ensure every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents wherever he is, and whatever it costs the company. Eisenhower's 10 plants became 64 portable bottling plants across every theater. They were operated by 148 civilian technical observers in Army fatigues with officer rank and pay. Soldiers called them Coca-Cola colonels. By war's end, over 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola were consumed by American military personnel. The Army's daily newspaper, Stars and Stripes, revived in London in April 1942. By January 1945, it printed simultaneously at 25 locations. Circulation exceeded 1.2 million copies daily. It was editorially independent. General Eisenhower personally championed and protected this. He insisted no official control over Stars and Stripes content. The result, a newspaper publishing Bill Maldon's Willie and Joe cartoons, which mocked officers and bureaucracy, alongside war news and baseball scores. General George S. Patton wrote furious letters to the paper. The paper published them. The United Service Organizations, USO, staged roughly 700 shows daily by Germany's surrender. By war's end, 7,300 entertainers performed 420,000 shows across all theaters. Combined audience, 130 million service member attendances. Bob Hope traveled over 80,000 miles performing in hospitals, on airfields, ship decks, sometimes close enough to hear guns. Reset beat, a BAME. Reframe. This was not accidental kindness. This was a deliberate, strategic doctrine articulated at the highest levels. Behind all this was a doctrine. George C. Marshall articulated it at Trinity College, June 15, 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. He said, "It is not enough to fight. It is the spirit which we bring to the fight that decides the issue. It is morale that wins the victory." Eisenhower later wrote in Crusade in Europe, "Morale is the greatest single factor in successful war." These were not throwaway lines. Marshall saw them as strategic principles. An army cared for, he believed, would fight harder, hold longer, and recover faster. He built the systems to back this belief. At its wartime peak in 1945, the American Red Cross had 5 million volunteers and 39,000 paid staff. It operated nearly 2,000 recreation facilities abroad with 5,000 paid workers. It received $784 million in contributions during the war years. It operated 3,757 chapters across the country. It was one of human history's largest volunteer mobilizations. Its purpose, not to fight the war, but to sustain those fighting it. In the weeks after D-Day, 10 Clubmobile groups, each with 8 trucks, crossed the English Channel. They landed on Normandy beaches. Approximately 320 women in the initial wave drove their own trucks off landing craft. They navigated the invasion wreckage into a country still fought over field by field. They drove through the Bocage country, where American infantry died at a worse rate per yard than WWII. They set up at crossroads, field hospitals, ammunition depots, wherever soldiers concentrated and flat ground allowed parking. They started making donuts. Trucks were camouflaged with moss green netting. This was to avoid Luftwaffe reconnaissance. The women learned to identify incoming artillery. They distinguished outgoing from incoming fire, a skill most infantry replacements took a week to develop, a skill the American university training course had not covered. Some clubmobiles were cinemabiles. They carried movie projectors, portable stages, even pianos. Others carried only donut machines and coffee. All carried something no machine could produce, the presence of an American woman. A woman who knew the right slang. Who could talk about baseball, Len Miller, and apple pie. Who could look a 20-year-old soldier in the eye and make him feel for 5 minutes like he was back in the world he had left. Some women went on foot when roads were impassable. They carried donuts and coffee to soldiers through terrain trucks couldn't navigate. Others loaded aircraft with donuts in the Mediterranean. Supplies reached men on islands and airfields clubmobiles couldn't reach. Reset beat, C, pivot. While American morale infrastructure expanded, the enemy's system was inherently unstable, built on a foundation of conquest. To understand why the German military never built a clubmobile system, one must understand what they built instead. The Wehrmacht was not indifferent to morale. Its welfare infrastructure, Truppenbetreuung, meant troop care. This system was administered by the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, the Reich Chamber of Culture, and the Nazi Party's leisure organization, Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy. Kraft durch Freude ran front theater troops performing plays and variety shows. It operated soldier cinemas and Soldenheim, rest facilities where men could sleep, bathe, and eat non-field rations. It ran frontline book vans, Front-Buchhandlungen, distributing reading material. It operated the Wehrmacht's radio network, the Wehrmacht Sender. This included the famous Belgrade station that broadcast Lili Marleen, the song becoming an unofficial anthem for soldiers on all sides. Some of this was effective. Lili Marleen was so popular Allied troops, the BBC broadcast its own version. Field kitchens, goulash cannons as soldiers called them, efficiently delivered hot meals close to the front. Rations averaged 3,600 calories, reaching 4,500 for field rations. But the German system differed fundamentally in 3 ways. First, it was state propaganda. Every piece of entertainment, newspaper, film was controlled by the propaganda ministry. There was no stars and stripes, no editorially independent newspaper where a cartoonist could mock a commanding general and keep his job. No free press in the foxhole. Second, it assumed conquest. The Wehrmacht's logistics, including food, relied on living off the land in conquered territory. This worked in France. It worked for a time in the Soviet Union. It meant when land could no longer be lived off, when the army retreated onto German soil or places stripped bare, the entire system collapsed. Third, and most crucially, there was no donut dolly equivalent. No system sent women from home to the front purely to remind soldiers of the country they left behind. German soldiers' contact with home was the Feldpost, military mail, and Kraft durch Freude programming. He did not have a woman from his own country hand him a donut and ask about his hometown. The German military, priding itself on understanding combat psychology, never built the one thing the American system proved more effective than ideology, a personal, not political, connection to home. A German frontline soldier's daily reality in the war's last 2 years was one of declining standards. The Wehrmacht leadership could not arrest this. The bread ration, once a source of pride for its reliability, included increasing filler. Margarine replaced butter. Artificial honey replaced sugar. Ersatz coffee from roasted barley or acorns replaced real coffee. Cigarettes, often Spanish-made for Wehrmacht distribution, were tightly rationed and unavailable. Chocolate was a luxury. There was no ice cream. No Coca-Cola. No portable bottling plants. In the late stages, often nothing existed except what soldiers scavenged or captured. Reset beat, countdown. This widening gap in material support would soon be starkly revealed in the Ardennes. Compare this to an American soldier in the same theater, same month. He received 3,500 calories daily. He had near universal access to chocolate, chewing gum and cigarettes. He drank Coca-Cola, bottled in portable plants in France. He got hot donuts and coffee from a Clubmobile. He read that morning's Stars and Stripes. He might see a USO show in a barn within earshot of guns. He wrote home on Red Cross stationery. The mail system functioned efficiently, even in combat. If wounded, he received care in the most advanced, best-supplied hospital system in any army. The disparity was so extreme that captured German POWs in American camps often ate better than they had in the Wehrmacht. They were served the same rations as American soldiers. The food was abundant and varied. The contrast was so stark it created domestic controversy. At camps in the American South, German POWs and white American soldiers ate at the same tables. Black American soldiers, serving as guards, were segregated. In a Texas camp, German prisoners used the same latrines as white Americans. Black soldiers were directed to separate ones. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, a black American soldier, wrote to Yank magazine in April 1944. He described eating in a lunchroom kitchen while German prisoners were served at the counter. The American morale system, for all its ingenuity, contained contradictions that would take another generation to resolve. By 1944, even the Wehrmacht's existing systems disintegrated. Civilian rations in Germany dropped from 2,780 calories daily, winter 1942-43, to 1,980 the next year, to 1,670 by 1944-45. They dropped to 1,412 in the final year. Frontline military rations held up longer, but only by stripping food from occupied territories. Daily calorie allocation for civilians in occupied Poland by late 1943 was 855 calories. For Soviet POWs, it was functionally zero. Over 3 million Soviet POWs died in German captivity, primarily from starvation, exposure, and disease. When the Wehrmacht launched its final major offensive, the Ardennes, in December 1944, the operation was premised on total logistical failure. The German plan required capturing American fuel dumps to keep panzers moving. The offensive couldn't sustain itself on German supplies alone. On December 17, 1944, Kampfgruppe Peiper, under SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, overran an American fuel depot at Büllingen, Belgium. It seized 50,000 gallons of gasoline. Peiper's troops forced American POWs to refuel German tanks. This scene would have been unimaginable in 1940. Then, the Wehrmacht's logistics were the envy of Europe. By 1944, the most elite armored unit couldn't advance without stealing enemy fuel. Even stolen fuel wasn't enough. Peiper's advance stalled within days. There was no more American gasoline to take. The contrast with American soldiers in December 1944 was not subtle. While Peiper's men siphoned American fuel at gunpoint, American soldiers in the same theater received hot donuts from Clubmobile trucks. They read that morning Stars and Stripes, drank Coca-Cola, and sometimes watched a USO show organized 3 days after the German attack began. The American system didn't stop during the Battle of the Bulge. It kept running. Clubmobiles kept serving. Jill Pitz-Knappenberger and the crew of the Cheyenne were in the Ardennes that December. They did not leave. The most dangerous German offensive since 1940. The attack that produced over 80,000 American casualties in 6 weeks. The battle that came closer than any other to breaking the American line. And the donut trucks stayed. They stayed because the women driving them understood something Peiper, with all his tactical brilliance, did not. They understood that the soldiers who would stop the German offensive needed more than ammunition. They needed to know someone still thought of them as human beings. The truck at the crossroads was not a luxury. It was a lifeline. Not for the body, but for the thing inside the body that makes a man stand up when every instinct says stay down. Reset beat. A refrain. The general spoke of physical destruction, but the true devastation was the moral collapse their system enabled. After the war, Allied intelligence officers questioned captured German commanders. The answers were consistent and incomplete. Rundstedt listed his 3 factors: air superiority, fuel, railways. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes, said Allied air forces found targets everywhere. Bomb carpets throttled German supply. General Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin wrote in his 1956 memoir Panzer Battles that the Ardennes proved large-scale armored offensives fail against an enemy with supreme air command. General Odilo Blobnik, commanding a panzer division, described Operation Cobra near Saint-Lô on July 25, 1944. He called it hell. Planes kept coming, like a conveyor belt. Bomb carpets came down. Front lines looked like a moonscape. 70% of personnel were out of action. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in June 1944, simply stated, "The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements. There is simply no answer to it. Air, fuel, bombs, railways, armor." These words filled post-war German accounts. Missing was everything unseen from 15,000 feet, or through binoculars. Missing was the donut truck at the crossroads. Missing was the Coca-Cola colonel refilling a bottling plant. Missing was the Stars and Stripes copy in a foxhole, read by a private who hadn't heard from family in 3 weeks. He could at least read yesterday's baseball scores, knowing his world still existed somewhere. In a converted manor house in North London, Trent Park, British military intelligence, MI-19, recorded what German generals didn't know. Between 1942 and 1945, 84 captured German generals and hundreds of staff officers were housed comfortably. They were given chess sets, books, and garden access. They were encouraged to talk freely. They knew nothing of microphones hidden in every room, including bedrooms and lavatories. A fake aristocrat, Lord Aberfeldy, an intelligence officer named Ian Munro, hosted them. He kept conversation flowing. British intelligence officers, many German Jewish refugees, transcribed 64,000 conversations in a basement. These transcripts, 100,000 pages, were deposited in the National Archives. Historians Schönken Neitzel and Harold Welser later published parts. The Trent Park conversations are invaluable. They capture what German officers actually thought, not what they later wrote. In those rooms, believing no one listened, they spoke with candor. They discussed war crimes. They discussed the July 1944 bomb plot. They discussed German weapons technical failures and strategic planning failures. And they returned, repeatedly, to why an army that conquered France in 6 weeks and reached Moscow's gates in 5 months was being driven back. Driven back by an opponent every German officer in 1940 dismissed as militarily insignificant. The published transcripts focus on war crimes, the July 1944 plot, ideology and technology. American morale infrastructure isn't prominent in these extracts, but the underlying theme across every conversation about why they lost is material abundance. They couldn't get past it. They circled it like a bruise. They had been told throughout the 1930s that Germany's enemies were soft, decadent, incapable of sustained sacrifice. What they encountered was an enemy soft in ways that proved to be strength. An enemy that insisted on comfort the Wehrmacht considered unnecessary. This turned out to be the difference between an army that held together and one that fell apart. The famous line, widely circulated, about a German officer finding a chocolate cake from Boston and declaring the war lost because Americans could fly fresh cake across the Atlantic, is fiction. It comes from the 1965 film Battle of the Bulge. It was written by a screenwriter. It never happened. Getting the history right matters more than drama. Real evidence of the German reaction to American abundance is less cinematic, but more important. It's Rundstedt listing 3 factors, not a 4th. It's Manteuffel describing his supply system as already inadequate. It's Peiper's men stealing American gasoline at gunpoint. The Reich couldn't fuel its own offensive. By December 1944, the most experienced military professionals in Europe launched an attack whose entire strategic logic depended on capturing enemy supplies. They no longer had their own. Reset, beat, see, pivot. This wasn't merely about resources. It was about a fundamental philosophical difference in how each nation viewed its soldiers, something the post-war German memoirs don't acknowledge. something historians of the clean Wehrmacht myth spent decades excavating. German generals writing about American material superiority after the war weren't just analyzing defeat, they were constructing an alibi. If Germany lost due to more American trucks, planes and fuel, then Germany didn't lose because its officers enabled a genocidal regime, not because its soldiers committed atrocities, not because its high command made catastrophic, ideologically driven strategic decisions. The material superiority argument was convenient. It presented the German officer class as brilliant professionals overwhelmed by brute force, not as participants in a rotten system. This matters for our story. German testimony about American logistics, while real, is colored by the need to make American abundance the sole explanation. The truth is more complicated. American abundance was real. American morale infrastructure was real. But its success wasn't simply more trucks. It was that America used some trucks for something the Germans never considered. The trucks carried a message. The message was, "You matter." On May 23, 2012, the U.S. Senate passed Resolution 471. It commended the women of American Red Cross Clubmobiles for exemplary service. Senator Susan Collins, sponsoring the resolution, said, "A visit from a Clubmobile was one of the most significant events for a young GI in combat far from home." It took 67 years for the Senate to say it. The women who drove those trucks through Normandy, the Ardennes, and across the Rhine, those still alive in 2012, were in their late 80s and 90s. Many had never spoken publicly. Many tucked diaries and photographs into drawers. They got on with life, like veterans of every war. The war receded. The country moved on. Liz Richardson is still at Normandy. Plot A, row 21, grave 5. She is 27 years old forever. She will never be older than the war that killed her. Her grave is in the same cemetery as the men who stormed the beaches she served behind. The men who lined up in the mud for a donut, a joke, and 5 minutes of feeling remembered. She lies among them because she was one of them in every way except the rifle. The question of why German generals couldn't believe American donut trucks followed the front line has an answer. They couldn't believe it because it demanded understanding war in a way their tradition hadn't prepared them for. The Wehrmacht understood firepower, maneuver, and supply. It understood the mechanics of killing and movement. It did not understand the mechanics of caring. The German military tradition, for all its brilliance, assumed the soldier existed to serve the state. His purpose was the mission. His value was utility. His morale was sustained through ideology, discipline, belief in a greater cause. The American military tradition was younger, messier, less theoretically sophisticated. It assumed the state existed to serve the soldier, not perfectly, not without hypocrisy or racial segregation. But fundamentally, the American system rested on the idea that the young man in the foxhole was sent by a democracy. The democracy owed him something. Not just equipment, training and leadership, but acknowledgement that he was a citizen before a soldier. His comfort, dignity, and connection to home were not luxuries. They were obligations. The American military in World War II, for all its flaws, understood one thing. The Wehrmacht did not. The man in the foxhole is not a component. He is not a mechanism. He is a 19-year-old kid from Indiana, Alabama, or New Jersey. He hasn't slept in 3 days. He watched friends die. He's asked to do it again tomorrow. Whether he stands up or breaks is sometimes decided by things unrelated to training, equipment, or doctrine. It's decided by whether anyone in the vast machinery behind him remembered he is human. The donut was never about the donut. It was about the hand that gave it. It was about the woman from home who looked him in the eye and said, "Hi, soldier, what's cooking?" and meant it. It was about his country spending fuel, shipping tonnage, and human lives to get that donut to him. Not because a donut wins battles, because the man who eats the donut does. The women who drove those trucks, who died in plane crashes, who served under shell fire, who never picked up a weapon, understood what Helen Purviance understood in 1917. Sometimes the most important thing for a man asked to die for his country is reminding him his country knows he is alive. Field Marshal Rundstedt missed the fourth reason. He missed the truck. He missed the war.